Hello, this is the lecture on monetizing non-monetary impacts, part of the cost-benefit analysis course, officially MN4354, Financial Analysis and Cost Management, within the Army Cost Management Certificate course, or the CMCC. So, to give you, this lecture is about. This is about the idea of how do we actually, as I've said from the very beginning of the course, we have to be able to make apples-to-apples comparisons. We have to put everything in the same yardstick. So how are there ways when we have non-monetary impacts to actually assign dollar values to them? So for example, and these are often, by the way, benefits. You know, you have benefits, whether it be saved time, saved lives, etc., that aren't in dollar terms. And the question is, how do you compare those to the costs, which usually are in monetary terms? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk first about, as I say, pricing the priceless. How do you actually assign a price to, things that people either don't know how to price or think, frankly, shouldn't be priced? And we'll talk about the methods of market valuation, contingent valuation, and revealed preference. And then we will actually apply those different methodologies, different approaches to those common examples in cost-benefit analysis, when we look at the value of time and looking at the value of life. And then finally, a conclusion or wrap-up. So first, let's talk about pricing the priceless. So remember that this is from the very beginning. We talked about, very first week of class, talked about three different types of costs and benefits. There are those that are relatively easy to quantify. And that gives us a simpler cost-benefit analysis and with fewer assumptions. There are those that are hard to quantify, but which you can estimate. These are things like the cost of lost time, the probability of a future event, the value of a life. In other words, we can quantify them, or we can estimate some sort of quantifiable measure of them, but they may require certain big assumptions. And finally, this category of no idea how to quantify, right? The value of readiness, cleaner air, improved aesthetics, things that you're like, may not really know how to measure those. But we will, of course, give you some tools to think about how to measure those things. And in that case, you'll sort of need some special decision criteria when those impacts are significant. When things that are more difficult, maybe even you have no idea going in, certainly how to quantify in order to incorporate them in cost-benefit analysis. Now, previously, up to this week, we focused on the things that are easy to quantify. In fact, not only are they easy to quantify, we've been focusing almost exclusively in dollar terms. This week, however, we're going to focus on things that are harder to quantify, things that we can quantify or with to some measure, but they're difficult to quantify. And then even, ideally, in some cases, even if we quantify them, how do we maybe get those into dollar terms? So we're going to look at the more difficult sort of types of costs and benefits this week in terms of quantification and monetization. And note that those two ideas, quantification and monetization, are distinct, right? Sometimes you can quantify an impact, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can monetize it, or you're not sure how to monetize it. For example, you could measure improved targeting, right? Increase accuracy from 80% to 90%. But how do you convert it to dollars? What does that mean? Is that worth $1 billion? Or is it worth $1 million? $1,000? How much is 10% improvement in accuracy worth in terms of dollars? But for full calculation of net benefits, cost and benefits must all be measured in the same units. Remember, net benefits is, of course, all of your benefits minus all of your costs. Well, if they're not measured in the same terms, you can't take dollars minus percentages, or $1 million minus 100 minutes. That doesn't mean anything. Everything's got to be in the same units, preferably dollars. Not always, and we'll talk about later this week, or we'll talk in a separate lecture about how we can sometimes not be the same units, will not necessarily be dollars, but preferably, since costs are almost always in dollars, it's easier if we can put everything into dollar terms. But the problem is that anything that's not traded in a market, right, like human life, is difficult to monetize. How much is something worth if we don't have prices, we don't associate prices, we aren't asked to pay for these things on a regular basis? So it may be, although in the previous slide we talked about these three categories in terms of things that are easy to quantify, hard to quantify, and no idea how to quantify. Really, probably more important are, not just quantifiability, but also monetizability. So perhaps you should think about things that are, categorize things according to the following three categories. First, what's quantifiable and monetizable, right? Might be either directly or indirectly monetizable, and we'll talk today about things that are indirectly monetizable, what things are quantifiable but not monetizable, right? So you can quantify them, right? But maybe you can't put them in terms of money, customer satisfaction, accuracy, some other quantifiable measure, but you're not sure how that translates into dollars. And then finally, the things that aren't quantifiable at all, that are really subjective, and you really can't, quantify them in any sense. Arguably, I think you could find a way to quantify almost anything. Now, how good that quantification is, how reliable it is another question. But let's at least allow for the possibility that some things we can categorize as simply not quantifiable. So then in that case, we could have the following sort of way of thinking about all potential costs and benefits, or impacts, costs and benefits, like as I mentioned, sometimes what's a cost, what's a benefit is not necessarily clear. Is it a benefit, or is it a negative cost? Is cost savings a benefit, or is it something that comes out of cost? Anyway, but if you take all impacts, all costs and benefits, they are certainly, you can group them into either quantifiable or non-quantifiable. And then within the quantifiable, they can be directly monetizable, right? The cost is clear. This is the, if you know the exact cash outlays for something, the financial costs, or even some measure of the benefits. If it's directly monetizable, that's one group. The others are sort of indirectly monetizable, and we'll talk about some of those today. Things that, well, we don't really think of those in money terms, but we can put a money measure on them. Maybe the cost of time, or the cost of the value of life, things like that. We can put they are monetizable, but indirectly, and they're not traded in a market maybe. And then those that are just not monetizable, that we really can't, or would not be. We can't in any accurate or reasonable way translate them into dollars. Well, the previous weeks we've been talking about things that are both quantifiable and directly monetizable. That's what we've been focusing on so far. And in the next lecture, which we'll have a little bit of a discussion, but also lecture, we will talk about non-monetizable impacts. And so we will talk about what do we do with things that are seemingly non-quantifiable and certainly not monetizable. How do we handle those? But today we're going to talk about things that are quantifiable but are indirectly monetizable. That's what this lecture is about. Things that aren't directly monetizable but are indirectly, we can put them in dollar terms, and that makes our life easy, right? If everything's directly monetizable, in other words, this category on the left here, then that's the easiest, right? If everything is either directly or indirectly monetizable, that's the next easiest. At least we can get everything in dollar terms. And then the most complicated is when you have significant impacts that fall into this last category, either non-quantifiable or quantifiable but not monetizable. So in terms of, by the way, these indirectly monetizable things, we're talking about, most provocatively, things like human life, but also a little less provocatively about things like time, things that are not directly monetizable. It may seem like it's impossible to put a dollar value on such abstract things, on the value of a life, for example, but we can do it, right? Economists have developed approaches to do so, and that's what this lecture is about, is approaches to how we put dollar values on some of these more abstract things. And frankly, we must do it, right? Much of government activity is focused on costs and benefits for which there's no formal market price, right? What is the market price? I mean, things like national security, environmental quality, health and safety, preservation of life. People, well, how much is national defense worth? Well, we don't buy and sell. We budget each year, but it's a public good. People aren't asked to pay a particular amount for how much they value it. They're not have to trade it in a market. Same things with environmental quality, health and safety. These are all things the things that government does tend to be public goods. So what that means are things that are benefit everybody, or benefit if you do them, they benefit everybody. You can't exclude anybody from that benefit. I can't clean the air and only allow certain people to breathe the clean air. I can't protect the United States homeland and only allow certain people to benefit from that. The entire country benefits from that. So those sorts of things that the government does, always. The core role of government are these sorts of things in terms of, that are not traded in markets, right? And so government cost-benefit analysis routinely has to assign monetary values to non-monetary costs and benefits, right? We're always trying to think about the value of human life and things like that in government. So that said, but how measuring it it's still an inexact science, right? Even some of the state-of-the-art techniques are still fairly crude, right? We have a method, so these are, we can indirectly monetize things, and we're not they're sort of estimates, but nonetheless, there are several proven methods for assigning ballpark values to costs and benefits. And you'll see at the end why ballpark is sufficient in some cases, right? You might want to know precisely, for example, how much a human life is worth, right? But if you can get a ballpark estimate and say, look, the government should not spend, $3 billion just to save one human life, but they should spend $1 million to save one human life. Then if you look at a project and say, look, this one saves so many lives that this saves lives at the cost of $20 million per life saved. Well, that at least falls within the ballpark, right? And so the idea is if you can get the ballpark values, then that helps you, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, even if they're not as precise as some of your directly monetizable costs and benefits. So today we're going to focus on 3 approaches that economists use to indirectly monetize such non-monetary impacts. The first is called market valuation. Second is contingent valuation. And the third is revealed preference. So let us first talk about market valuation. So market valuation is, pretty much what it sounds like. What's the market say? But we tend to think, well, there is no market, right? So if a cost or benefit lacks a clear price tag, it is often assumed we can't look it up to the market valuation, right? We don't see that in the market. But that said, maybe not directly, but if you got to look in the right place, right? And so common angles from which the analysts find a market value for non-monetary impacts are, for example, the opportunity cost of the non-monetary impact. What do you give up, for that benefit? That would suggest that in some indication of how much you value something is how much you give up to obtain that something. The market value of comparable goods or services. There may not be, again, a direct or exact market. Something may not be traded in a market, but there's something comparable that is traded in a market. But also things that are maybe the change value of downstream good or service. So, for example, there may be things that, you may improve, the quality of the environment in a certain area of Michigan, right? Well, you may not be able to measure what that, people didn't trade in a market environmental quality, but what happened to home prices, right? What happened to the value of properties as you improve the environment, right? That is a downstream good or service that might reflect, the market, give some indication of the market value of the non-monetary impact. So let's first talk about this first approach of just looking at opportunity cost of the non-monetary impact, the first market valuation approach. Well, so the idea is that, again, there may be a benefit or cost that is non-monetary, but there may be some monetary opportunity cost associated with that. For example, the benefit of time saved, or the cost of time wasted, could be valued using the hourly wage rate, right? Since that is, the wage rate is some trading of time. They trade your time by your hourly wage rate. So there may be when you lose time, you waste time, you save time. All those sort of things, you're giving up maybe the opportunity to work and earn an hourly wage. That's the opportunity cost of time wasted. So it does provide a good estimate of the true value of the cost or benefit if you have those opportunity costs. But the problem is they don't necessarily always exist. So the next sort of market valuation approach is to look at the market value of comparable goods or services. So given that government services are often received for free, right? There's, you might get, free health care, free child care, free, whatever, some sort of services, free legal services, whatever it might be, the government might provide. But for many of these publicly provided benefits, there are at least comparable items sold in the private sector, right? So you can use the price of the private sector equivalent to estimate the implicit price of the publicly provided benefit. For example, the benefit from the Army providing child care services at Fort Belvoir can be approximated by the price for comparable services off base, right? Maybe people don't pay for those child care services, but they might pay for something comparable. The idea is what's the private sector equivalent? If I get free legal help, so what's the benefit of that? What's the benefit I get from that? What's the value? What's the cost of that? Well, in particularly the benefit of free legal services can be certainly gauged by or compared to, what it would cost me to get those legal services in the private sector, in the open market. Right? There are comparable equivalents to many government provided goods and services. Now, the disadvantage of that approach is the idea that, okay, so first the idea is that understand the market price does not necessarily reveal the true cost or the true benefit. For example, the idea is what is if the market price of, for example, private sector legal services is, say to produce some sort of contract was $1,000. But I use legal aid or family court services or whatever it might be that's freely provided, and I get the same service. Does that mean that it's worth $1,000? The benefit is $1,000? Well, not necessarily, right? Because, for example, I didn't go to the private sector. I didn't actually pay that $1,000 for it. So therefore, the fact that I didn't pay $1,000 for it would suggest that, I didn't value it worth $1,000. I got, that might be what I would have had to pay for it if it hadn't been publicly available. But I chose not to use that. And maybe if the publicly available service was not there, I still wouldn't have used the private lawyer or whatever. So that is not therefore you can't assume that the benefit I'm getting is certainly what I would have paid for or had to pay for something in the outside market. And moreover, what people pay for something in the market is always less than what they're willing to pay. So in other words, when I buy a car for $20,000, what is that car worth to me? Well, it's not worth $15,000, or I'm irrational, but if I'm paying $20,000 for a car, that it's worth at least $20,000 for me. But the idea is it could be worth 20, 22, 23, 24, 25, 28, 30, 50, $1 million, right? All that is I value it at least that much. And so therefore the benefit that I really get from that is not reflected by the price. It's actually the price is sort of a lower bound of the benefit that somebody gets, that a buyer gets from a product or service. Also, on the other side too, right, what about for cost? Does the market price reflect anything about cost or what the seller's value for that good or service, or what they'd be willing to give up? The answer is no. It reflects an upper bound, right? I'm not going to sell something, think about it, me selling my prized, Pez dispenser collection, right? I'm not going to sell it for less than what it's worth to me. But if I do sell it for a given price, what is that I value that at that something at or less than the price. It doesn't mean that I value it at the price. I sold it at that price, but I could value it significantly less. Or similarly, if you're using market prices to think about costs, right? Because maybe in the public sector we don't always have as good measures of our costs in terms of overhead and other things that might be allocated. But if you think that price is a reflection of cost, the answer there is, well, no, not really. A seller or a supplier or producer sells something at a given price, if and only if that price is above their cost, at or equal to their cost, above or equal to their cost. So all we know is that the costs are actually something less than or equal to that price. Right? So again, market price doesn't necessarily directly reflect benefit, nor does it directly reflect cost. But also, some things there aren't a private sector equivalent. So there aren't comparable goods or services. National security. You might be. What are you going to compare it to? Blackwater, and it's not the same, right? There's never going to be a clear equivalent, or clean air. There are certainly no private sector equivalents for some things that are non-monetary benefits or costs. So the last sort of approach to market valuation of impacts is looking at the changed value of a downstream good or service. For example, suppose a government program or a government benefit or something, or any thing being evaluated in a cost-benefit analysis provides an intermediate benefit that is not sold in the market, right? But suppose it does affect the value of some other good or service that will be later sold in the market. Then the idea is we can see, okay, we didn't actually buy or sell that service, but the benefit or the impact of that service or affected the value of something downstream. For example, here I mentioned the idea of housing prices, but here's an example. The idea is, what's the benefit of a cleaner environment? Well, to people, what are the ideas that, well, if housing prices increase, by so much because of a cleaner environment in the area, then that indicates something about the downstream sort of benefit of that valuation of that impact. But here's another good example: is the value of a training or education program can be estimated by comparing the average incomes of those who complete the program to those who do not. Right? The idea is what's the benefit of an education program? Well, what for people, take a comparable group of people, some of whom get the training, some of them don't, some who go to college, some who don't, or whatever it might be. See what the change in compare their incomes are, their salary, what they're paid, and that certainly suggests, to some degree, what the market values, what the market says that training or education program is worth, because that's how much it increases the person's earning potential, how much you're willing to pay them. Now, the disadvantages, there are disadvantages to the approach, there are disadvantages to all approach, right? It assumes that the change in the value of the downstream activity captures all the benefits, right? The idea is, what's the benefit of college? Is it really just changing income? Arguably, there's certain people who, people go back to school and get their MBA and have less income, right? Maybe they were a Wall Street trader making buku bucks, but they really didn't want to do that, and so they went back to get their MBA, and they, then go into, nonprofit work or something that makes them happier. You could marketing, who knows what it is, but they might actually have less income than they did before. Now, does that suggest that there's a negative value to that education for them? Not necessarily, right? The benefit of college, for example, is not simply about improved income. It's a sad statement about our society that I think that college has become so much more of a training or job training. Sort of the whole point of college is train you for jobs. I certainly think about my dad being a philosophy major, and I think there used to be the idea you go to college for a liberal arts education. It wasn't specifically training you for a particular job. Now it seems like people are expected to be deciding what their career is going to be and what their job's going to be in their freshman year, and they go in a particular field that doesn't train them on sort of general knowledge or ways to think or ideas, but actually training them for their job when they get out of college. There's also an issue of selection bias, right? You may want to compare those who got the those who got the training and those who didn't, for example, but they may be different, right? People who didn't get the training they may be lazier. I don't want to do that. They may not, there may be other things that you can observe, right? Not observable traits that you can't control for statistically that mean that are also explaining why the income is different between these two groups. It may not just be because one group has the training and one doesn't, right? And it's also, the idea is how it's difficult to isolate the impact of any one program or policy alone. There could be many, many things that are impacting the market value of a particular good or services. And so the idea is that if a new government program causes a change in the downstream price for a good or service, was it all attributable to that government program? It's not clear, right? In fact, there may be a negative impact. So in fact, the what's attributable to the government program may be larger than the price increase, right? Because there might be something else that caused the value to go down, right? So again, it's very difficult to isolate. So that's market valuation. Those are three different approaches we talked about to market valuation, and they each have their pros and cons. And when you can do that, it's a pretty good approach. Another approach that's used, usually when you can't really get a good market valuation, is contingent valuation. Now, what is contingent valuation? Well, contingent valuation is basically simply asking people, what's it worth to you, right? And so when there is no obvious market price, right, for things like, we said, environmental quality, national security, things like this, then sometimes the best approach may be simply to ask people, right, how much is it worth to you, right? And this, of course, has its pros and cons. But contingent valuation is a method in which respondents are asked to place a value on some non-monetary cost or benefit. For example, questions like, how much do you value having Yellowstone as a national park? Right? And the goal is to use the survey responses, to estimate the overall value of the cost or the benefit. And there are good practices and bad practices in doing that. And there are benefits, or there are pros and cons to that approach. It's certainly straightforward, right? And it's not that complicated, or you don't have to do. Doing a survey doesn't cost as much as doing some intensive market valuation approaches or revealed preference approaches, which we're going to talk about in a second. But and moreover, it has the advantage of it's certain things that you couldn't really estimate by any other means, such as non-use values, right? For example, existence value, right? What if I don't use it, but I value it being there, right? I haven't been to Yosemite since I'm 3, or maybe I never intend to go there, but I value it because I value it being there. I like the idea of being there. So it's valuable to me that we have this national park, even if I'm never, ever going to use it. So there's existence value. So that's not going to be reflected in a market, right? Because you only pay for things in a market that you actually use. Option value, right? Well, I've been meaning to go to Yosemite for a while. I went there when I was 3, but I don't really remember that, right? And so I value the option of being able to use it maybe one day. But right now, my value of Yosemite is not reflected in any market valuation because I'm not currently paying to go to Yosemite. And so therefore, how would you measure it? Well, with contingent valuation, you measure. Also, the idea of bequeath value, right? What if, look, I don't necessarily know that I'll use it, but I want it to be there for my kids or grandkids, right? So that's something else that because I'm not paying for it, I'm not using it, I'm not paying for it. There's no market indication of what I value it. Pretty much the only way you could actually see assess my value of the benefit is to actually maybe do contingent valuation. Right. And the advantage, again, is you do not need to observe any behavior. Right. It allows you to value anything. Right? It's very flexible. You don't need to observe behavior. You can you assign values of things that might not otherwise have any way to assign value for. That said, there are some issues. Right. Are they answers reliable? Right? The idea that if you ask a hypothetical question, you'll get a hypothetical answer, right? What's my incentive to tell the truth, right? Why do I think about it? How much is Yosemite worth to me? $1 million, right? If I overstate or understate the value, what's the big deal? I've got no particular incentive to, put much effort into figuring out what something truly is worth to me. Right? And therefore, it's certainly less reliable than if we can do a market valuation, or we can do what we'll talk about next, revealed preference, which are actually looking at actual choices you make, about real things paid with real money, right? Because, I found this, for example, when I do this with, we've done a lot of work with non-monetary incentives in the military. And first of all, you tell somebody, hey, would you like to have the home port of choice? You like to have, a sabbatical, telework, flexible work week, these sorts of non-monetary benefits. And they say, sure, sure, sure. And they're all excited about it. How much you like it? I like it a lot. Then you say, okay, then you ask them, how much would you be willing to give up, for example, in your salary or your retention bonus or your reenlistment bonus in order to have that non-monetary benefit? Well, and then suddenly many people go, oh, well, I'm not going to be willing to give anything up. I wouldn't give up $1, right? So you value it so much, but you're not even willing to give up $1, right? And that's even based on what they say. And then when you actually ask them to put the money where their mouth is and actually have to give up money for something, you find that they're actually willing to give up even less. So again, contingent valuations tend to overstate true value because you don't have to put your money where your mouth is. Also, there's a danger that the respondents may answer strategically. So, for example, the idea is that when I we do these surveys, for example, about non-monetary incentives, right? And we ask people, well, how much is this worth to you? And the problem there's two issues. One, they may think two strategic issues. When I say how much is worth to you, I may think that you are going to actually make me pay what you say. Well, how much is it worth to you? And I make there's some possibility that you might actually ask me to pay what I say it's worth to me. In that case, I might want to understate my valuation because I don't want, if it's worth $1 million to me, it's worth, let's be realistic, if it's worth $1,000 to me, but I think I might have to pay what it's worth, then I might say, it's really only worth about $500. It's only worth $100, or maybe it's worth nothing. Right? This commonly happens, by the way, when, for example, I live in a neighborhood with no homeowners association, right? So, I think about, okay, well, how would we go about, there's no HOA. So how do we go about, for example, if we wanted to do some improvement, to the, area around, our community? Well, just think about what if we went to everybody and said, well, we want to, who knows, we want to, clean up the lake that's next door. How much is it worth to you? Well, if people thought they would actually have to pay what they were being asked, they would, even if it was worth a lot to them, they would understate that, right? And so if respondents believe they may actually be required to pay the amount equal to their stated valuation, they will have an incentive to understate the valuation. On the other hand, right, they might have if they think they won't have to pay, they might want to overstate it. For example, with these non-monetary incentives, when we ask service members, how much would you like to have home port of choice? They know it's a survey. They may think, somebody may be thinking, it seems to me, they may think about the motives of the survey. They may think, well, I think maybe the Navy or the Army or whoever's doing the survey, they may be thinking about, offering this non-monetary incentive. And I really want it. So I'll say, oh, it's worth lots and lots and lots, because I think that if a lot of people say they really like it, then the Navy, the Army, the Air Force will actually do it, right? So in that case, they may have incentive to overstate their valuation. So these are the idea of answering strategically. The first issue is that people don't have much incentive at all to put much effort into it or answer truthfully. But certainly they may have, if they do think about it, they may have an incentive to misrepresent, right? Any incentive they have might be to actually either understate or overstate their valuation, right? Also, what about budget constraints, right? So we will often get responses where things will say, how much is it worth to you? $1 million, $1 trillion, you know? How much is human life worth to you, right? Infinite. Well, okay, then you're basically ignoring any budget constraint, you know? I mean, if you're saying a number that's beyond your means, right, then what does that really mean? That certainly is different from market valuation, because in the market, you'll never actually be able to pay something. You'll never pay beyond what you could possibly pay, right, and borrow. On the other hand, if you strictly say, well, instead of thinking what the benefit, what the if you don't ignore your budget constraint and instead you try to stay within a budget constraint, then something might be worth a lot more to you, but because of your budget constraint, you report a lower value, right? And so there, the idea is that now suddenly, you know, if the value of something is a function of the income. So the idea is if you ask a group of people what it's worth to them, they may give you one response of the benefit, you know, thinking in terms of what they would pay for it, given their current budget constraints. And if you increase everybody's income, now suddenly the benefit's much higher. Well, how is that? It's the same thing. It's the same benefit. It doesn't affect them any way differently. Well, because now they can afford more, right? And so then the idea is now suddenly, you know, your values are associated with, are changed with income. And that shouldn't necessarily be the case. So again, these are other issues with contingent valuation. And also, it's, you know, I can get different answers depending on how I ask the question, right? You know, for example, if you ask issues in isolation or ask them, you know, among multiple, you get different responses, right? So here's an example. Respondents report 5 times greater value for items like, quote, visibility at the Grand Canyon, unquote, when asked about this alone than when asked to evaluate several such items. For example, if I said, you know, well, how much is it worth to you to improve visibility of the Grand Canyon, you know, by 10% or something? And you could now see, you know, 10% farther on a clear day or whatever. And they would say, oh, it's worth, you know, $10,000 to me, right? But then if you say, well, what about visibility of the Grand Canyon? What about you know, cleaning up the water surrounding, you know, Mount Rushmore? What about this? What about that? If I list a bunch of different environmental cleanup efforts, now they're thinking, okay, well, now suddenly they're having to value all of these. They tend to assign a lower value, significantly lower value, you know, when they are asked about, you know, things within a group as opposed to in isolation. Also, simply the order you ask them. Here's an example. You know, if I say to you, well, what's the value of saving a whale? And then ask you what's the value of saving a seal. Or if I ask you what's the value of saving a seal, and then ask you the value of saving a whale. Well, whatever I ask you first, you will put a higher value on something if I asked you first than if I ask you second, right? So in this example, when they asked about seals first, seals were worth $142, a life of a seal with $142, and a whale $172. When you asked about the whales first, the seal was worth only $85, and the whale was worth $195. Right? So now clearly in both cases, of course, the whale was worth more than a seal, you know, but the point is there's a big difference between 142 and 85, right? In terms of the valuation of a seal. And it really depends upon whether you were asked about the seal first or second. And so again, how reliable can the data be if it's sensitive to all these design issues? So that's the issue of contingent valuation. Again, it's very powerful, very flexible. It can value things that you could never value otherwise, but there are a lot of issues with it. The third sort of approach to monetizing non-monetary impacts is the revealed preference approach. Now, under revealed preference, the idea is that we look at what you do, right? You know, people may lie, but their actions do not, right? And so if we can, people will indicate their true preferences based on what they actually do. And so we observe actions that may not be, again, these are things that aren't necessarily traded in a market. So they're not necessarily you buying and selling things in a market so we can see what you value things based on what you pay. But we can see other actions that indicate or reveal or can be extrapolated to give us the idea of a market price, right? You use observable market data to make inferences about non-market values, right? And so for example, you know, if you think about how significant are the costs of noise pollution from an Air Force base, right? Well, again, if you could compare home prices based on distance from the base, you know, holding constant other aspects of the homes and neighborhoods, that would give you some indication, you know, of, you know, what the dollar value is of avoiding, if you will, the noise pollution from the Air Force Base, right? And so those are sort of, and we'll talk about how we use revealed preferences both in terms of the value of time and the value of human life in a second. Now, some of the issues that are with revealed preference, we like it because it does, you make you put your money where your mouth is in some sense. But sometimes the link between the monetary impact and the related market price might not be terribly strong, right? It's not, things like noise pollution and home price, may or may not be, you may be getting a lot of noise in that. There might not be that indicative. And of course, it's difficult. It's not as easy as just asking a question. You have to actually observe actions. You have to take, and you have to, observe actions, and you have to see what the, prices are. You have to do some analysis, and sometimes it's not even feasible. It's not really something that you can figure out necessarily what the direct impact is, or what the you may not be able to observe what the choices people are making that are related to that. And even in doing so, there might be a lot of effort in gathering that data. So it's not as easy as something like contingent valuation, but it's certainly, I think more reliable. As an economist, I always sort of think that, and based on my experience, I certainly think that, I trust what people do more than what they say. So let's actually look at these in terms of examples. So the first example is the value of time. And these are the two, the value of time and the value of life. These are the most common sort of non-monetary impacts that we have to value in, or assign monetary values to in cost-benefit analysis. Now, a lot of government programs are about, saving time, right? Expanding a highway, widening a highway is about saving commuting time. But, think about, examples such as this. Consider an Army command is exploring options for reducing waiting times at the CAT card office. Well, what's the benefit of less time wasted by personnel? What's the benefit of less time wasted by the way, dependents? Right? Or do we not care, about the dependents? But generally, what's the benefit of less time wasted? Or suppose the federal government considering highway improvements to reduce traffic and speed up commutes in a very busy corridor. Again, what's the total value of time saved by everyone who will gain the benefit of a faster commute? So many government programs are often about, or initiatives are about saving time. So these are situations in which you'd want to sort of assign a dollar value. Is it worth the cost that we have to incur? Well, we will go through each of our three approaches and see how we would apply each of our three approaches to the market valuation of time, right? Three approaches to the monetization of the non-monetary benefit or cost of time, right? And the first approach, of course, market valuation, right? Which would be, things like valuing a person's time at a person's wage rate. We'll give other examples. Contingent valuation, asking people the value of their time. Revealed preference, sort of observe actions, for people's actions, how much they actually value their time. And so we're going to actually illustrate each of these approaches in depth. Let's first take the market valuation. The market valuation of time. Well, the most obvious, of course, is hourly wage, right? If time saved means more time working, right? Like the CAT card office, if personnel are going to the CAT card office during work hours, and certainly the productivity loss, the cost to the service is what we're paying them during that time, right? And so again, the idea is that the hourly wage, when we can think about time in terms of as being trade-offable, that any time saved or gained, any time saved or time saved or wasted or lost is time that could otherwise be used, for labor, either for an employee's perspective to get paid or from an employer's perspective to actually get that benefit from the employee, right? Then the hourly wage might be appropriate. But the problem, of course, is things like, how does the hourly wage accurately reflect, value of leisure time, right? How do we reflect value of leisure time, right? Because the idea is, in some sense, it might be a good measure, right? Because if I am getting an hourly wage, and I choose to work more hours, then every hour I work, to some measure may be an hour that I could have spent with my family or doing whatever, or on Facebook, or who knows what it is, right? And so therefore, it might be a good measure of the value of leisure time. But there are some problems in trying to use the hourly wage rate to value time. For example, it might overstate the value of time, right? You can't always, it's not like, I could, it's not like I could, in some jobs I work 40 hours and I can only get paid 40 hours. I'm not going to get paid overtime. I can only work so many hours a week. And therefore I couldn't, it's not like I could, if I spend an hour in my free time waiting at the DMV, it's not like, geez, I could have spent that hour working. Well, maybe I couldn't have, right? Or maybe it's the other way around. It's that the idea is there's a minimum number of hours I could work. But either way, the idea is it's not like every hour spent in your day is a time you could spend receiving an hourly wage, right? You might be able to work. If I work at I shouldn't say 7-Eleven. I'm sorry. Let me think. If I work at a department store, obviously the only hours they may only allow me to work so many hours a week, but certainly I can only work the hours of which the store is actually open, unless I'm a security guard, I suppose. So it's not like you can freely add and take away hours at that hourly wage. Right. And, my value of leisure time could be lower than my hourly wage. Right. So the idea is, certainly if I choose to do something, for example, in the evenings, as opposed to take time off work to do it, that indicates I'm more willing to give up leisure time than I am to give up work time. So therefore, my leisure time is worth less to me than my work time. So therefore, valuing leisure time, at the hourly wage would overstate the value of that time. On the other hand, it could understate it, right? This hourly wage capture everything. Well, what about benefits, right? So I get, not only do I get, my hourly wage when I work. I mean, I'm not an hourly employee, but if I was an hourly employee, not only would I get my hourly wage, I would also get benefits. I would get, whether it be healthcare benefits or other benefits, or just, the experience or any other benefits not captured by my hourly wage. So therefore, valuing time strictly at the hourly wage may understate the actual value of that time, because I actually might be getting, in some sense, compensation beyond that hourly wage. Even if I just enjoy working, right? That I get paid whatever, say $20 an hour, but I enjoy it. Well, so the idea is that the enjoyment value is also to be added on top of that $20. So again, the wage might understate the true value, right? Also, people do take unpaid vacations. So if you take an unpaid vacation, right, that's indicating, because you've already used your vacation time, you want to take more vacation, that indicates to you that, in that case, you would rather have that leisure time than have your hourly wage. So in that case, in those cases, you value your leisure time more than the hourly wage. So in that case, the hourly wage might understate the value of time. So again, we typically use hourly wage to sort of as an indicator of the value of time, but there may be reasons that might understate or overstate. So there are, again, with all of these, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you anything that says this is the right answer. And each of these has their pros and cons. And that's why, by the way, for example, we often will do in cost benefit analysis, we will look at market valuation. We might do market valuation, contingent valuation, and revealed preference to get different estimates and then triangulate, right? To see if one's giving us a wacky estimate compared to the other, then we might want to throw that out. But if we sort of get similar estimates from all three approaches, then we can be more confident in our estimate. All right, so the next approach, of course, is contingent valuation. So how do we apply contingent valuation to the valuation of time? Well, contingent valuation would essentially involve asking people how much their time is worth, right? So you might say, how much would you pay to wait 10 minutes less in line? How much would you pay to reduce your daily commute by 1 hour, right? Again, as we've said, one of the problems with contingent valuation is that people may not tell the truth. If they think they may actually have to pay that amount, they may understate their value. I mean, what if I went up to somebody in line and said, hey, how much would you pay to, be first in line here at the cat card office or at the movie theater, right? Well, if they think, okay, well, I might lowball you at first. I'll pay $2, right? Because I might think it's a bargaining process. I might think that, I might actually have to pay what you ask. If I think I don't have to pay, I'm sitting at the cat card office. I want to, sort of, you're asking me, how much is it worth to you to make wait times at the cat card office lower? And people would say, oh, well, it's worth a lot. I certainly want to do that. You should do that. So it's worth a lot of money to do that, because I think that if by saying that it's worth a lot to me, I may likely get that. I mean, I think about this in terms of parking at MPS on campus. Students will complain about the availability of parking. And I remember I used to say to them, I said, why is there no parking available? Why is parking so hard to find parking on campus? And they would say all these things about, oh, well, they don't build this or that. And I would say, that all may be true, but the bottom line is the reason it's hard to find parking on campus is it's free. At the time, I literally lived like 300 yards from campus, or maybe not, but certainly less than 500 yards. I lived pretty close to campus, but I drove every day or almost every day to work. And I said, why do I do that? Because you're not charging me, right? If you charged me to park, I had faculty parking lot. If you charged me to park, guess what? I would walk or I would bike, right? But the point is that when people think that they don't have to pay for it, they'll say it's worth a lot. And so in this case, people would say that adding parking, or more available parking, on campus is critically important at MPS. But when you say, well, okay, would you pay for a parking pass? Heck no, right? So the idea is that they will state that it's worth a lot to them, but then when they actually, have to put their money where their mouth is, not so much. So again, the idea is valuation of time by contingent valuation does have its disadvantages that any contingent valuation approach has. What about revealed preference? How do we, think about observing people's actions and their choices and what that reveals about their preference or their value for time? Well, this is actually sort of the preferred way that economists use to value time, with revealed preference, right? Because we can actually, unlike the market valuation works for like the hourly wage, but we can actually see how you value leisure time by your choices, right? So consider 3 areas in which people's choices reveal their value for time: housing location, modes of transportation, and waiting to save money. So let me give you examples of each of these and how the economists have used those to sort of estimate the value of time. In terms of housing location, consider 2 homes that are virtually identical except one is a 5-minute shorter commute downtown, right? And if the house with the shorter commute costs $20,000 more than the other house, this price difference may reveal the value of time saved, right? This is something that you will commonly see that, the shorter the commute. I live in, right now, I'll tell you, I live in Hollister, which is a long 50-minute commute to campus at MPS. But I got a big family. I'm remarried. My wife has 3 kids. I have 3 kids. I need a home office. I need at least a 5-bedroom home, right? Well, guess what? A 5-bedroom home on the Monterey Peninsula is pretty freaking expensive. In fact, they're almost unavailable because, they have their older homes that are like sort of these, a lot of these are like these beach cottages. They don't even have homes that big much on the Monterey Peninsula. And certainly if they did, it'd be almost, too expensive for me to afford. And there are some closer neighborhoods, but they didn't have, for example, good schools. But that's something different than the valuation of time. But there's some indication that I can afford the home I have now based on the fact that, would I rather be on the Monterey Peninsula with this exact same home? Absolutely. If I could take this home and put it on the Monterey, directly in Monterey or Pacific Grove, I would prefer that. However, it's more affordable because it's farther away. And so that's some indication of the value of what I'm willing to value of my time in terms of commute. Of course, I, try to avoid commuting as much as possible and then work out of the home. Of course, this approach does run into problems because the 2 homes are never identical, right? There's always going to be some differences that we can't observe. We can't exactly compare 2 homes, one closer than the other, right? And there may be some there's some differences that square footage, number of bathrooms, things like that. How old the home is. You can observe them and you can account for them with statistical methods. Others might be very hard to measure. Right, or unobserved, and things that you can't really put into a statistical model, and so therefore, there may be some problems with using housing location to infer the valuation of time. What about mode of transportation? Right, the idea is okay. Well, let's compare trains and buses. Right, trains are more expensive but less time consuming than buses. So if people choose to take a bus, between Washington, D.C. and New York, as opposed to a train between Washington, D.C. and New York, right? That should indicate something about what the value of time is, right? Again, nonstop flights versus, flights with a layover, right? Again, some indication what your valuation for time is. You end up at the same place in both cases, but one takes more time than the other, right? And we've done that in doing these results. They find that the value of time is about half of the pre-tax wage. So the hourly wage actually would overstate sort of the value of time if, according to these studies on the mode of transportation. And usually, of course, notice that these transportation modes are taken during your leisure time. So that suggests that certainly commuting time or transportation time is valued at less than your hourly work time. What about waiting to save money, right? Well, here's an example. During the oil crisis of the 1970s, the government imposed price ceilings on some gas stations, but not others. Why? Don't ask me. But because they did that, long lines formed at the cheaper gas stations, right, that had price ceilings. And so at Chevron stations in California, for example, gas was 39.5 cents lower and the average additional wait time was 14.6 minutes. So people were willing to wait 14.6 minutes more to save 39.5 cents per gallon. And the average purchase was around 10.5 gallons. So if you do the math, people were willing to wait 14.6 minutes in order to save about $4.15. So that means that they valued an hour of their waiting time at $17, which corresponded closely to the average hourly U.S. wage at that time. So again, notice again this triangulation of different approaches. The real preference seems consistent in this case with the market valuation. But again, these are different ways that we can actually assign a monetary value to the non-monetary benefit or cost of time. Now, what about the value of life? Now, that's always the fun thing. So how do we think about a market valuation, or how do we think about, assigning a monetary value, putting a dollar value on life? Now, what we understand is that many public programs, we have to do this because many public programs, whether it's here's examples: dams, maintaining roads, traffic signs, provision of healthcare, employment of firefighters, all these sorts of things that we do as a government, or government does, often tend to prevent the loss of lives or about saving lives. Right? So how much should we be willing to spend to do that, right? And so the idea is that we, this is certainly probably the single most difficult issue in cost benefit analysis, but it's why there's a lot of research done in this area, because government programs, always have to say, is it worth it? Is it worth it to do it? In many government programs do save lives, but the question is, how much are we willing to spend to save a life? How much should anybody be willing to spend to save a life? How much should you be willing to spend to save, a life that's important to you? Of course, some people would say priceless, right? Spend everything, infinite, right? The idea is people will suggest to you that it's crude, unfair. People will oppose cost-benefit analysis for these reasons, that you cannot value life in monetary terms, and it's immoral, inappropriate to sort of put a value on human life. And in fact, the value of human life is infinite. Well, if the value of human life is infinite, then any project that would save one life would always be justified no matter what its cost was, right? Because it would save one life. So we should as a society be willing to spend an infinite amount of money to save that life, right? And that's obviously difficult. That's obviously unrealistic. That obviously is not helpful, right? The life is priceless approach, basically, it doesn't help us in terms of decision making. And we ultimately have to make, to get some guidance decision making, we've got to make trade-offs, right? Government can't do everything. They can have multiple programs that save lives. So the idea is which ones should we do? Which ones shouldn't we do? If we've got to choose between them, which ones are the most important? Which ones, no matter what, just don't justify the price tag, right? Whether it's, choices between, devoting resources to saving lives, or devoting resources to some other use that's maybe not saving lives, but such as education that benefits us in some other way. So the idea is, well, how much is a life worth in terms of sacrificed education spending, right? Or what about different types of lives? What about oncology treatments versus AIDS medication, right? The idea is again, we've got to make these choices. We can say, well, how many lives will oncology treatments save versus how many lives will AIDS medication save? Again, we've got to, as a government, like it or not, somebody's got to price put a price on life, right? These are sort of inevitable trade-offs, right? And as I wrote here, it's a tough decision, but someone has to make it. Right? So to think about it, consider two real-world policy decisions to think about the idea of the value of life. So the first story is about General Motors exploding trucks. So back in 1993, consumer groups demanded that General Motors recall 5 million pickup trucks. They had side-mounted gas tanks, and that made them more likely to explode on impact. And it was estimated that it had caused 150 deaths in 15 years. So the recall would cost $1 billion to do, and it would save at most 32 more lives. Or, in other words, it would cost $31 million per life saved. So, does the recall make sense? Now, you might say, well, I'm not paying for it, but the bottom line is, as a society, somebody's paying for it. Does it make sense for us to have to push for a recall that costs $1 billion to save 32 lives? Right. Well, in the end, GM reached a settlement and did not recall the vehicles, but instead agreed to invest $50 million in burn units and educational programs about seatbelts, drunk driving, etc., and also to buy 200,000 safety seats for low-income families. Now, in response, Ralph Nader called this settlement, quote, the most unprecedented buyout of law enforcement officials by a culpable corporation in regulatory history. Basically they're buying their way out of killing people, right? But was the settlement really so bad, right? the government estimated that the child safety seats alone, the 200,000 child safety seats alone, would save 50 lives for a $50 million price tag. So less than $1 million per life, right, is how it came out. So they could save lives. So by GM doing that, they saved lives at less than $1 million per life. And certainly that's far more cost effective than the $31.25 million per life that would be saved from the recall, right? So the idea is that, do we want General Motors, if they're going to spend their money on saving lives, we could have them spend their money, saving lives, at $1 million each, or saving lives at $31 million each. Even if it's General Motors money and not your money, not the government money, we certainly would rather have them spend the money where it would have the most bang for the buck, right? So in other words, the settlement actually saved more lives with a much lower price tag than the recall would have. Another example, consider the London commuter train crash. So in October 1999, a commuter train crash at London's Paddington station killed 31 people. As a result, the public demanded the government upgrade its braking system on its trains to prevent this from happening in the future. And the government, in fact, pledged to maximize safety, quote, at any cost, right? We will do whatever it costs to maximize safety. We hear a lot of that, you hear that all the time in politics on certain things. We must save our lives from people from whatever, Ebola at any cost, whatever the latest threat that might be, the politicians might be wanting to talk about, right? Well, in this case, they first looked at a braking system that would stop trains at speeds under 75 miles per hour and cost $700 million. The second braking system, though, was better in the sense that it would stop trains at any speed, but it would cost between $3 billion and $9 billion. It would save 1 to 3 lives per year for 30 to 50 years, or in other words, it would cost between $20 million or $300 million per life saved, right? And as opposed to something that could save a fair number of lives, but at a much lower cost, the first braking system. So the government, in fact, backed down from the quote any cost pledge, and they in fact went with the first braking system, right? Because again, the idea is it sounds all well and good politically to say we'll save lives at any cost, but then when it comes down to it, that doesn't, not only is it harder to put your money where your mouth is, but also it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to spend public money in ways that would, if you could save more lives at a lower cost or lower cost per life saved, that's what we want our government to be doing, right? And also, they pointed out that whereas for example, the second braking system would have cost between $20 million or $300 million per life saved, right? If they there were studies that they did that showed that if you just increase road safety, you would save lives at a cost of only $2 million per life. So if you take the same amount of money, put it towards road safety, you would save far more lives than you would save by this, enhanced or braking system. So again, this is an example where the government's got to make a choice and got to put a value on lives and got to decide, how much a life is worth. So again, as we did before, let us again explore each of our 3 approaches and how they monetize the value of life. Right? Market valuation, contingent valuation, and revealed preference. And again, we will illustrate each approach in depth. So first, market valuation of life. Now, the method that is common, the market valuation method that is used is called the foregone earnings method. Right? This method basically says that the value of your life is your expected future earnings, right? Because that not only would have been what you would have earned and gotten from living, but also what your productivity would be, right? The idea that, look, if society, your benefit to society is somehow reflected by what society is willing to pay you, right? If you earn, $100,000 per year, that means you bring $100,000 in benefit to society or to somebody, to business or whatever. But your benefit of your work time is that $100,000 per year, right? And so the idea is this sort of measures the productivity gains from extending life or from avoiding death, based on sort of your contribution to sort of national output, if you will, right? What your lifetime earnings would be, or would have been if what your lifetime earnings would be, if you lived to a certain date or lived to a longer time, or what often happens is that they're evaluating what your lifetime earnings would have been when your life has been lost prematurely. And this is what courts often do. When you file wrongful death suits, right, they will often, figure out, okay, well, somebody died, what are the damages? After they figure out liability, what are the damages? Well, and they'll value the death at what the foregone earnings were. For example, a man who dies at 35 in a car accident, they often will award the man's family the net present value of his lost lifetime earnings, and it comes out to about $650,000. So that man's life was worth $650,000 according to this approach. Well, what are the problems with this approach? I'm sure you already are beginning to think about, I'm not so sure about that. There certainly are some problems. First of all, it excludes certain things. The market valuation of life, you're saying that my value of life is simply my work productivity. Well, that excludes the value of leisure or any other time that's not spent working. It excludes the value of just being alive, right? It's only valuing the value of my work. Also, what are the value to friends, family, and others from the person being alive? So the externalities, right? It's not just that my employer benefits or I benefit from me being alive, but others, I would hope, benefit from me being alive. Beyond my financial contribution, right? And so again, the market valuation of life sort of tends to exclude or understate, certain aspects. Also, because if you do include things like leisure value, research estimates actually value a person's life to be 5 to 10 times future earnings. So the idea is that, for example, here's one research result. An average 20-year-old female has a future earnings NPV of 487,000. But values life at 3.1 million, or the value of life. If you look at the actual value using real preference, etc., of their leisure time, in the end, the total value of their life is 5 to 10 times what the future earnings are, right? At best, right? That said, your future lifetime earnings does sort of reflect what you'd be willing to pay to avoid death, right? Because you obviously can't pay more than your net present value of your lifetime earnings. Right? If I could borrow against all my future earnings and pay it to avoid dying today, right? The most I could, do would be to pay what my net present value of my lifetime earnings are. So in some sense, that is my willingness to pay to avoid death, simply because that's the most I can possibly pay to avoid death, right? But it does possibly understate the valuation of life. There's also sort of troubling social judgments here, right? We're valuing people based on their what they earn. Right, so people with higher income have higher values, right? If you're going to kill somebody in an accident, better kill somebody who doesn't make a lot of money, right? It says that poor people are worth less than rich people in terms of their income, at least. Young people are worth more than old people. Males, by the way, are worth more than females, right? Since for the same job, there's a wage disparity. What about people who choose not to work? What about homemakers, students, retirees? They're worthless, right? If you're going to run over somebody, run over a retiree, right? Because the court will say, well, by the foregone earnings method, the damages, there's no real damage there. And similarly, what about people who can't work? What about older people? People who are handicapped, people who are sick, who can't work? By this method, their lives are in fact worthless. So that's sort of the market valuation. What about contingent valuation? How much people say a life is worth? So contingent valuation, approach asks people about their valuation of life. You certainly can ask directly, what is your life worth to you? But they usually ask questions a little more, if you ask how much life worth to you, people will give things that, that's a question they can't really answer too much. And they will say things like, it's worth everything. It's worth infinity, whatever, but so instead they often are framed as extension of life or probability of dying questions. For example, you might ask, how much less would you pay for a house near an environmental problem that may reduce your life by 1 year versus an identical house without these issues, right? So what is 1 year of your life worth? And people will think, well, I would probably pay, say $30,000 less for that. Well, then you're saying that each year of your life is worth $30,000 and therefore we can value your life. Or ask somebody, how much would you pay for a plane flight with a 1 in a million chance of crashing versus a 2 in a million chance of crashing, right? If what people are willing, what the difference and what they're willing to pay is reflective of how much they value their life, right? And that said, these approaches have a very wide range. These estimates go from anywhere from $825,000 per life to $22.3 million per life saved, right? So there's a wide range there. Now that said, that gives us some ballpark, right? We certainly, this suggests that even with this wide range, you don't want to spend $100 million. You don't want a program that costs $100 million per life saved, right? On the other hand, if you could save a life for $500,000, this suggests do it. So again, even though it's a wide range, it can provide some help. But what about revealed preference? Revealed preferences are the last way about what actions do people take to preserve life, right? And these sort of indicates, based on people's choices, the revealed preference indicates their valuation for life. So this sort of examines how much people actually pay for things that lower or increase their odds of death, right? And from that, I can impute, how much you value your life by the choices you make, by how much you pay to reduce your probability of dying. And economists tend to look at two sort of areas in doing this. One is occupational choice, and the other is investments in safety devices, etc. And so let me explore each of these. First, in terms of occupational choice, understand that, some occupations are simply more deadly than others. So this chart sort of looks at the number and rate of occupational injuries by industry sector. And we see that up near the top, and by the way, the red is the number of fatalities. The blue, which is on the right, so these over here on the left, these are the number of fatalities. Here are the fatality per 100,000 workers. So construction has the most fatalities, but agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting has the most fatalities per 100,000 workers. Mining, we all know, is very dangerous. So again, very high rate of death per likelihood of death. Transportation and warehousing. So again, you can see these different professions have different rates of fatality. Well, and riskier jobs have higher wages, all else equal, right? The idea is for the same skill set, in the same state, in the same area, in the same region, for the same age employee, everything else, observable being the same. One person works in the mine, one person works in a factory or whatever, a safe factory maybe or whatever. One person. The idea is that, guess what? The jobs that are more dangerous pay more. And we call these compensating differentials, right? And we can impute the value of life by determining the amount of income a person will forego to reduce the probability of a fatal on-the-job accident. Right? For example, and by the way, this is the exercise that is on Sakai for you to do is something like this. So hopefully I explain it well so you can complete the exercise well. Suppose you're choosing between two similar jobs, and the annual salary of job one is $40,000 higher than a job two. But in any given year, there's a 2% higher risk of death at job one than at job two. So then the implicit value of life is therefore, $2 million, right? The idea is, if you look at these two, and you are, if you're just willing to, if job one paid, say, $41,000, you would take it. If job one paid $39,000 more, you wouldn't. That suggests that $40,000 is the equivalent compensating differential, which makes you sort of indifferent between the two jobs. In that case, the implicit value of life is therefore $2 million, right? Because you're willing to, it costs $40,000 to increase their likelihood of death by 2%. So therefore, to increase your likelihood of death by 100%, you would have to figure out 40,000 divided by 2%. So therefore, 2 million. So based on that, revealed preference, occupational choice, this example, you would have the implicit value of life being $2 million. The other sort of revealed preference approach to valuing life is the observing how much people pay for life-saving devices. For example, passenger side airbags, if those are optional, right? Or side airbags, or whatever, smoke detectors, whatever it might be, right? For example, take the case of a passenger side airbag. If the cost is $350 and installing it has a 1 in 10,000 chance at saving a life, right? Then the implied value of life is $3.5 million, right? So for $350, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of saving a life. Then you are implicitly valuing life at $3.5 million. Your passenger's life, right? If it was your life, you might value it a little more. Other examples of real preference, purchasing a more expensive, safer car with a lower probability of death versus a less expensive or less safe car, or willingness to pay for safety devices like smoke alarms. These things all indicate, something about how much we value safety and therefore how much we value life. Problems with the approach, of course, in particular, think about the occupational choice approach. There are some problems with that. First of all, it sort of assumes that workers and consumers fully understand the risks, and employers, everybody understands it, but they may not, right? People don't, as we sort of saw when we did our thing about behavioral biases, people don't always evaluate probabilities very well, and they don't think about it necessarily. They're not able to necessarily do the math, the way we just did, right? And even if they did know the probabilities and knew the risks, nobody says, well, your risk of dying this year is this percent. I mean, you're not given an exact number. But even if you were, how would you make the trade-off? People don't necessarily know how to make the trade-off between probability of death and dollars. It's not necessarily clear. Also, even if you try to compare two groups, one that has, takes a high-risk job, one takes a low-risk job, it's not always clear that there aren't, you might try to say these jobs are otherwise identical, but there might be, and in fact, in the homework exercise, I ask you to assume they're otherwise identical. But in reality, right, there might be other job attributes that you can't observe that you're not controlling for that make one job pay more than the other, or one job worth more than the other, one job more difficult than the other. That may not just be about safety, right? Also, besides the jobs potentially being different, maybe the people are different. If I look at some people who choose to take the high risk job, people take the low risk job, right? It may be that estimating the value of life based on the wage differential doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that some people will value their life lower than others, but also they may value life. They may like to take risks. They might enjoy taking risks. They don't have a problem, and so therefore these risk takers may not need to be paid that much extra. Right? So not only the jobs may be different besides their difference in safety, so might the people, right, who take the different jobs. And so therefore, you might have a smaller gap in the salary differences because you might have a high-risk job and a low-risk job. And therefore, the overall population may think that the salary for the high-risk job should be $50,000 per year more. But because you don't need everybody to take that job, you only need some people to take the high-risk job, you take the people who don't value life as highly, or aren't as sensitive to risk, or more risk takers, less risk averse. And therefore, the wage differential may not be 50,000, which is the difference the whole society as a whole would assign to those two different jobs. It may be lower because you're only having to select the people who are more willing to take the high risk job. And so therefore, that may actually understate the value of life. So what are some estimates, of the value of life, across different studies using these approaches, right? So here's some studies, some meta-analysis, which means sort of studies that looked at a selection of other studies. So up top, there are 4 sort of studies of revealed preference, so revealed preference valuations of life, right? And we have everything from $2 million to $11.1 million in these various studies based on revealed preference. Based on contingent valuation, sort of asking people to make choices, how much would you, not just how much you value your life, but choices about, how much more would you pay for a safer airline flight? We see valuations ranging from 2.7 to 8.5 million. Right? So not that far off, but we do see values overall, looked at everything ranging from $2 million to $11 million in terms of the value of life. And that may seem like, wow, that's a broad range, right? 11 million is more than 5 times 2 million, right? But at least it does give us a ballpark. And again, the range is very broad, but it's narrow enough to be useful in the sense that if we looked at those studies and said, okay, well, we don't know we can't say exactly what a life is worth, but it's maybe worth somewhere between 2 million and 11 million. The highest estimate is 11, the lowest is 2 million. Well, then certainly we can rule out certain projects. We don't want to spend $20+ million for each life saved because the studies suggest that each life is only valued by people at about $11 million, right? So you don't want, so if you have a program that would save lives but does so at a price tag of 20, 30, 40, $50 million per life saved, then that suggests that that may be too much. The money might be better spent elsewhere. Similarly, though, if I say, well, we shouldn't do this because it's too expensive, and I value lives. I do a cost-benefit analysis that values lives at only $500,000 or $500,000 less. That's also, we could rule that out. That's invalid too, because we know that the studies at least say it's worth at least between, say, 2 million. At least worth $2 million per life, and maybe not above 11 million. But if I value life below that range or above that range in a cost-benefit analysis, then that's going to be questionable. It also allows us to compare, different programs. Which programs are more efficient in terms of, cost per life saved? Here's an example: emergency floor lights on airplanes cost about $900,000 per life saved, according to the studies. Whereas asbestos removal costs about $100 million per life saved. Right? Those are some big differences. Right? One costs 100 times as much. One is we're spending significantly less than what the value of life is to save a life. One, we're spending significantly more than the value of a life to save a life. Now, one thing, of course, what about inferences from government spending? So far, we have used revealed preference to infer the value of life from the choice of individuals, right? What about government choices? What are the choices of our government in terms of what they spend on, right? So, because presumably, right, the government should represent the preferences of the entire society. So what does government think a life is worth? So there's a recent study that reviewed 76 government programs aimed at saving lives, and they calculated the cost per life saved for each program. And the cost per life saved varied from around $100,000 to more than $200 billion, right? Which suggests that the government does not have a consistent sort of standard for what they should spend to save a life. That said, we could sort of, here's examples. So these are different regulations. The child-proof lighters, it only cost 0.1, so $100,000, about to save a life. As opposed to solid waste. Here we have cattle feed costs $200 million. Regulations on cattle feed cost $200 million per life saved. But you can sort of see how different regulations, have different costs per life saved, right? So, maybe the government doesn't give a consistent, sort of indication of what they think a life is worth. But that said, we certainly can compare programs and say, look, child-proof lighters, that's a no-brainer. Solid waste disposal facilities, cattle feed, I'm not so sure that that's really worth it, given what it costs, per life saved. So wrapping up in conclusion, so the last slide here, right? The idea is that there are often important costs and benefits that you should include in your cost benefit analysis that are difficult to monetize. So what do? Right? And it's hard to put a dollar figure on these things, but there are methods that at least provide a reasonable ballpark estimate. We introduced the market valuation method, the contingent valuation method, the revealed preference approach, right? And so we can at least get those ballpark estimates, right? And you should at least make some effort to monetize non-monetary costs and benefits, right? Because it's the only way to truly compare cost to benefits, right? Often you'll have costs that are in dollars, but benefits that are in lives saved or in time saved or increased accuracy or whatever, something that is not monetary. And so, how can you compare, whether it's worth doing it or not, if the costs are in dollars and the benefits are not in dollars? Well, you've got to make some effort to try to get those benefits into dollars, even if it's a ballpark, right? So you can say whether in the ballpark, does it seem to make sense, right? Also, to make apples to apples comparisons among courses of action, right? One course, you might be choosing courses of action, it'd be great if they all have the same benefits, maybe they all have the same benefit, and then you could just do a cost effectiveness study, right? And you wouldn't have to worry about the fact that the benefit is non-monetary. But if they have different net benefits, some are monetary, some aren't, right? And they have different costs, right? Then how do you compare these things? Well, the only way is to get everything along the same yardstick. And the best yardstick, of course, is, since your costs are already in dollars, if you can get everything measured in terms of dollars, in terms of money, or the monetary yardstick, then that's the best way to make apples to apples comparisons among courses of action. All right. So that's it on the notion of the difficult of things that are difficult to monetize, but you can monetize. In other words, on how you monetize non-monetizable benefits. In our next and last sort of lecture of the course, though, we will talk about what if it's you still really don't know how to monetize something, or maybe you shouldn't monetize it, or there's things left over. That how do you incorporate costs or benefits which are not necessarily monetizable? Even with these approaches, you're not getting there, right? And that's what we'll talk about last. So again, the idea is that some things are perfectly monetizable. Of course, monetize them. Things that are indirectly monetizable, you should monetize them, right? And then if there's anything left over, which is still non-monetizable, we will talk next time about how we handle that. Thank you very much.